Another interesting evidence supporting this. Okay, this comes. It's another. These are other data that supports pretty much the same story. They are simply represented in a different way, in a sense that we in this graph, what they do is that they split the group of countries in different regions, and you observe the evolution over time of foreign direct investments inflow, looking only at 3 years, 2013, 14, and 15. And what you observe is that there is a region, developing Asia, again, you should read this mainly as China, that has steadily increased the inflow of FDI compared to other regions, such as, for instance, Latin America and the Caribbean, that has, on the contrary, experienced a reduction in the capacity to attract foreign direct investments. Same story is true for transition economies. When you look at the standard, let's say, countries that back in the past that attracted most foreign direct investments, meaning Europe and North America, you observe that over time there has been a reduction between 2013 and 14, and then in 2015 these countries were again able to attract more foreign direct investments. But still, if you consider them if you separate them, both of them attracted less investments, less foreign direct investments than developing Asia. Okay, which is again a sign that the power of China is really changing the way in which we are used to interpret the organization of production activities in the world. Okay, so that's it for the FDI inflows. Now the question is, what about the foreign direct investments outflows? Okay, so basically, where do foreign direct investments go? Are these foreign direct investments going mainly to developed economies? Again, we can look at data. The answer is, well, yes, a large share. So basically, if you look at where do countries are investing, you observe that most of them are investing in developed economies. Okay, so just to look at this yellow line, the yellow, or let's say orange line, this shows you the share, and you observe that the share, I mean, in 2005 was something like, you should read it on the right vertical axis, was more than 80%. So more than the 80% of the share of world FDI outflows was in developed economies. But over time, this is going down, and in 2013 was something, 14 was something like the 60%. Okay, this again is due to the fact that the way in which there are countries that nowadays are attracting more foreign direct investments. There are developing countries that nowadays are attracting more foreign direct investments compared to what was happening some years ago. Last empirical facts that also I think is pretty interesting, because it gives you an idea or a sense of something that usually probably is not very well understood by people who are not investigating these issues in a sort of like a rigorous way. The third empirical fact is that the largest part of FDI outflows, so where do they go again, goes basically to near countries. Okay, so it is true that we live in a globalized world. It is true that nowadays it's very simple to take a flight and go everywhere. I mean, nowadays not, because actually presently there is no way of getting a flight and going wherever you want. But of course, this is an exceptional period. And probably, however, this exceptionality will last for some time. So anyway, we will have time to discuss about this when we will look at the COVID part of this course, which is basically your presentations. But so basically, what I'm saying now might change in the near future, because probably the way in which globalization was organized up until a few months ago will not anymore be the case in the next years, in the coming years. But again, supposing that we are focusing on our world before the COVID pandemics, what we could say is that at that time, the usual way of discussing about globalization was the idea of the global world. Okay, so we are all citizens of a single world. Is very simple to move around people as well as capital as well as goods. So basically, if today I come up with the idea that I want to open a new business in US, actually, yes, there are some institutional barriers and it's some costs, but it's pretty simple. Okay, I could basically operate my business wherever I want. This, of course, is partly true, but it's not the whole story. And the reason why it is not the whole story is clear if you look at the concentration of foreign direct investment around the world. Okay, and this, for instance, comes. It's clear if you look at this table. This table shows you the outward foreign direct investment stock from BRICS country. What are BRICS country? Anybody of you knows? Do you know which are the BRICS country? Anybody wants to try? The acronym BRICS stands for which country? Nobody wants to try. Let's see. You can also switch on your microphone if you want to try one by one, and you are brave, of course. No, I'm joking. So anybody wants to try and so anybody knows what the BRIC group of country is? Niccolo doesn't know. Okay, very honest. Brazil, Monia is in there, and actually Brazil is the B of the BRIC acronym. We still need the R, the I, the C, and the S. Don't look it up on internet because otherwise it's too easy. Okay, Russia, very good. Then we have the R. Anybody knows the I? Or the Russia, China, India, good. So we have Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Okay, thank you, Pauline. So these are actually the 5 countries that belongs to the BRICS. Okay, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, why are these important? Well, because these are emerging. They are so-called emerging economies. So they are economies that have been for a long time considered developing economies, but that during the last 20-30 years they have experienced a significant increase in their national GDP. Actually, a rate of growth that is larger than the one experienced by standard advanced economies. Okay, so Europe and the United States, basically. So so the BRICS group identify economies that are emerging as important players in the global economy, and it is therefore interesting to analyze some of their economic characteristics. And one of them is whether or not they attract foreign direct investment, and whether or not and where the foreign direct investment that they make, where do they go? Okay. And this is actually the answer that this picture is telling you. Okay, so so you see the column are the 5 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The row of this table tells you basically where do they invest in terms of foreign direct investments. Okay, forget about the first 2 big rows and just focus on the last one. Okay, the last part of the table tells you the top 5 developing and transition economies destination. Focus on the okay, focus on the first part of the table. Okay, so the first part of the table tells you the amount of investments at the world level and also the type of countries in which they invest. Okay, so Brazil, for instance, make most of the investments out of $185 billion. $155 billion are made to developed economies. only 30 billions to developing economies. Okay, and you should read this in the same way for the other countries. Now, what you observe is that for at least some of these countries, in particular China, India, and South Africa, most of the foreign direct investments that they make are made into developing and transition economies, not into developed economies. Okay, this is the first important information. So 3 out of 5 of the BRICS makes most of their investments into developing economies. This is not true for Russia, because, for instance, the largest share is for Russia is made into developed economies, but we will see that most of this goes into what? Well, into countries that are part of that are transition economies, mainly that are former members of the Soviet Union. So they are, in a sense, countries that are very close to Russia. If you look instead to China, if you consider China, India, and South Africa, what we will see that most of their investments that they make into developing and transition economies are made into countries that are geographically very close to China, very close to India, and very close to South Africa. For instance, if you consider China, you will see that the top 5 developing and transition economies in which they invest, which let me remind you, they represent the largest share of they attract the largest share of China's outflow FDI, so 655 billions out of nearly 800 billion. So out of 800 billion, 65 billion goes to developing economies, and these developing economies are mainly, and we see it by if you look at the bottom part of the table, these are mainly Hong Kong, Singapore, Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, and Indonesia. So mainly developing and transition economies that are close to China in geographic terms. Same is true if you look at South Africa. Okay, top 5 developing and transition economies for South Africa, meaning the main countries in which the main countries that attracts FDI outflows coming from South Africa are China, which I agree is a bit far, but also Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, all African countries. Okay, the same is true mainly if you look at India, and the same is true if you look at Brazil and Russian Federation. Okay, so basically, basically the take-home message that comes from this table is what? Is that we do live in a globalized world, but when you look actually at the data, you realize that most of the foreign direct investments that countries make are targeted into countries that are, even in geographic terms, relatively close to the home country. Okay, so yes, it is true that it is simple and relatively easier compared to years ago to create business worldwide, but at the end of the story, with most of the companies tend to create business in countries that are relatively close, even in geographic terms, to their home country. And why this is so? Well, why is it so? Well, it is so because still, even if we live in a globalized world, to organize and to manage companies from distance, it is still difficult. Okay, it is still complex. Still has significant costs. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. It becomes relevant also when we will look at some of the theories that we will start discussing in few minutes.